I'm always grateful to come to Presidency College, to come to Presidency University, and I have a slight regret that I cannot come back to Presidency College. History has made it impossible. But I like to come back to Presidency College because I got a good education here. But I think the best thing in my life also happened in this place. So I got out of Presidency College with much more than a good education. So I'm always grateful when I'm called to come back. I thought when I was asked to speak, when Shohan asked me, I gave him the title Marxist Truth. But later on, I thought that I could also have given the title which would plagiarize the title from Althusser's book, For Marx, because that was a book which I read, I think, when I had finished Presidency College. I think I was in Calcutta University, but it left one of the deepest imprints in my thinking and life. So I'm actually going to speak for Marx today, in a historical point where it seems slightly inappropriate, because I think Marx is actually being wrapped up in a kind of strange namelessness. So I'm going to talk to you first about that, and later on, I want to go on to talk about 4 different things which seem to me to be the elements of what I would call historically Marxist truth. That is, those are truths which I think no one in the modern world would deny. And we would not have got those truths about the modern world if Marx hadn't actually done his thinking. Now, history exists in 2 forms. One is history as the process of happening of events in reality. And the second form in which we encounter history, is history as an academic or intellectual discipline, through which we go back to the course of events and try to have a kind of accurate accounting of what has happened. Thinking about Marx, it struck me that history in the first sense sometimes actually creates a problem. History as a process sometimes actually obscures its own truth. What has happened in a slightly earlier point, because the present is always foremost to our vision. That is what we see clearly. And in some ways, the present actually obscures or obstructs our clear understanding of what lies just beyond the present in the past. And I think in a sense, and the task of history in the second sense is essentially to recover and recuperate the history of the past. And I think this is what we need to do when we think about Marx. So the point I was making was that I think today the activity we call history arises as a protest against the unpredictable and idiosyncratic relationship that the present establishes with the past. It's always strange combination of forgetting and remembering, I shall come back to that, and the arbitrariness of what it remembers and what it forgets. I think Marx's ideas are not being subjected are now being subjected to a strange form of namelessness that is paradoxically reserved for the most profound innovators in history. What I mean is something very simple, that when we light a fire, when we use a wheel, in a certain sense we pay homage to the forgotten people, people who are now nameless, but who created these things without which human life simply cannot go on. And I believe that in spite of the fact that, today, for instance, if you look at the universities, not merely in the West, I think this is also true of India, there is declining interest in a certain sense in reading Marx directly. I don't think this is actually a mark of the absence of Marx's presence in modern life. So I want to start by something which I wrote a long time back. I think when we had just started the Council of Political Studies, so it's also remembrance of the Council for Political Studies. We brought out a book which was presented to Professor Ramesh Ghosh, and I wrote a paper which I think has become more relevant today than when it was written. I wrote the paper in response to a very famous essay by an American sociologist. I thought it was a very Intellectually, I think it was an excellent essay, very, very intelligent. That was by Robert Merton, and the essay was called The Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. So some of you might be familiar with the essay. If not with the essay, you would be familiar with the idea. The essay argues, remember that the essay was being written in the 1950s, when on the one side, people who were opposed to Marxism feared that the world was being taken over by Marxists, the power of the socialist states, the force of the communist movements, where the socialist states were not established. And it seemed that the world was being actually taken over by the Marxist movement. And there was a certain kind of plausibility to the claim made by Lenin, for instance, that Marxism is all-powerful because it is true. Now, I liked Martin's paper, despite my disagreement with him, because it was a very clever argument. The argument was that when somebody makes a prediction about something in the future, when somebody says that 3 years from now something would happen, or 2 days from now something would happen, whether it happens or not does not always depend on the truth of the prediction at the time when it is made. And Martin gives again, I think, a very intelligent example. He says that suppose there is a bank which is very close to a factory, where most of the workers have their accounts in the bank, and somebody in the factory starts a totally malicious rumor, a rumor which has no basis in reality, that the bank is going to fail. So when this is a prediction, this is a forecast, and when the forecast is made, the forecast is completely baseless, because there is nothing to expect that the bank would not work. But this is the whole point in Martin, that if a sufficient number of people among the factory workers come to believe in this false prediction, and they come to the bank and ask for the money, no bank actually holds the amount of money which is deposited in its coffers, so the bank is going to fail. So what he tried to show was that the failure of the bank was not actually not a demonstration of the truth of the prophecy. The prophecy was false, or the prediction was false, but the falsity of the prediction did not stop it from being realized in history. So his argument is that it's true that it seems that the world would be taken over by the Marxists, but that does not mean that Marxism is true. I was intrigued by this argument. On the one side, politically, I didn't agree with it, but intellectually, I was fascinated by this because I thought that I was simply struck by the cleverness of the argument. When I thought about it, I thought that it's not an argument which is unanswerable. So I wrote my paper essentially to devise an answer to that argument. So my paper was called The Self-Falsifying Prophecy, where I said that you have to introduce only one element into the Merton scenario to make it work in a very different way. Because Merton's scenario, the fault in the Merton scenario is that his picture of a bank is not realistic enough. Because there's a manager of the bank, but the manager of the bank, the main feature in this story is that the manager of the bank simply does not act. He is just an observer, to the catastrophe, although the catastrophe actually affects him very deeply. I thought that this is not how human beings act to something which affects their lives in a profound way. So if I make the manager in this parable capable of action, that he responds to this situation, what would happen in this case? So my paper argued, I'll put it very crudely, but my paper argued that suppose I have a boiler in my house, and I fear that the plate of the boiler at 2 different points is getting weak and is going to burst. And I call in a couple of people who are experts, an engineer, and he confirms my fear, and he says that it's true that the plate is weak here, and it's very likely that your boiler would burst at one of these 2 points, right? So at the point when the prediction is made, the prediction is correct, right? But precisely because the prediction is correct, if I act on it, if I do not act like the manager in Merton's parable, if I act more realistically as somebody who is affected by the imminent future, and I call in a mechanic who actually puts patches precisely on those 2 points, then the situation would change in the following way. The boiler might burst at the end, right? Because there would be a discrepancy in the pressure between the rest of the plate and the 2 points where the plate has been reinforced. But you can be absolutely certain that the boiler would not burst at the 2 points at which, at the earliest point of prediction, the real point of prediction, it was supposed to. So my argument is that today, Marxism as a prophecy, Marxism as a prediction, set off both these types of responses. It set off a response in which people in the revolutionary movement, radical people all over the world, tried to act on Marx's work, and that changed history in some way. But particularly people like me who are leftists, we are sometimes indifferent to something else, which I now feel, paradoxically, ironically, illustrates the power of Marx's thought. The power of the thought of a thinker to move real people into actual action in social life in the everyday. We are indifferent to that kind of effect, which is the one which produced, I think, the self-falsifying effects of Marx's historical prediction. Because I think what is interesting is that if you look at the transformation of European capitalism, the capitalism of the 19th century was gradually transformed, in response to Marx's prediction, through initially, counter-cyclical measures, Keynesian economics, all kinds of things in which people who really took Marx's prediction seriously, at least feared that, they changed capitalism. And capitalism ultimately came to acquire a form where it was balanced with modern democracy, it produced a welfare state, and it gradually was transformed into something which was very, very different, from what it was in the 19th century. And I believe that the point that I'm making is a Marxist point, because otherwise you have to believe that the bourgeoisie, through its intelligence and through its compassion in a certain sense, realized the error of their ways and became contrite, and they started creating a system, capitalist system, which was more welfare-oriented. I don't think that is true. Of course, the bourgeoisie, the industrial classes, the economic leaders of society, they are extremely sensitive, they are highly intelligent, they read history, they respond to their sense of crisis and things like that. But I don't think the transformation of capitalism was because of that. I think the transformation of capitalism was predominantly, in my view, in response to the predictions that Marx made about its imminent crisis. So that is the first point. I want to say that, I do not regard Marxism as a theory of everything. So if you want, we can come back to that during the discussion, because I think a lot of bad things happened to Marxism and the socialist movement because of a belief, which is sometimes very widely spread, that what Marxism gives us is something like what John Rawls would call a kind of comprehensive doctrine, like religious systems. I do not believe that that is true. But that does not mean that we should not emphasize the things which Marx has given us and the truth of Marx. So that is what I'm going to talk about now. I'll touch upon, as I said, 4 of his central ideas and what they really meant. Really meaning, in each case almost, I would argue that there is a kind of common understanding of that argument. I'll sometimes give you my reading of the argument, which is linked to the common understanding, but in some cases is also somewhat different. And let me make a critical remark about Marx. I believe that, or let me make another point about theory. Marx was a great theorist, and I have taught theory, particularly political theory, all my life. So occasionally I was forced to think about the nature of theory. What is the nature of a theoretical intelligence? And one sort of simple response on the nature of theoretical intelligence is, I think, that a theoretical intelligence is like a distorted but special vision. There's some people who can see certain things, with an unusually enhanced vision, right? As if their vision is like a microscope, so that what no one else can see with an ordinary vision, they can actually see that. But I think, and it's because of that, at Marx's time, what Marx saw about capitalism, I think was seen by very, very few people. But occasionally, that kind of intensification of vision also comes at a cost. Comes at a cost in the sense that they're so absorbed with the fragment of reality or part of reality that they see with that kind of enhanced vision, it also creates a form of indifference in them towards other parts. And I think there is something like that in Marx's thinking about politics. I don't think Marx's thinking about politics during his time was wrong. One is the force of the modern economy through capitalism, for which I think Marx still remains the incomparable theorist. But it's also shaped very powerfully, equally importantly, by the forces of the modern state, which I think Marx neglected to some extent, although the Marxist tradition did not neglect it. If you think of more modern thinkers, two thinkers who came out of the Marxist tradition, Gramsci, who came out of the Marxist tradition quite directly, and Foucault, whose relation with the Marxist tradition I think is more complicated, but Marxism is a precondition for the development of Foucault's insight. So these two people, I think, contributed a lot to the understanding of the second force which shapes modernity, the modern state. But let me now turn to the 4 points I want to make about Marx. In each case, I can claim that I'm talking about a single concept or just a single idea. The first point is the idea of materialism. There was a book by a German Marxist written when we were very young. I think it must have come in 70s. Chauvin would remember. I think late 70s. There was a book by a German writer. His name was Alfred Schmidt. And I think his book was called Marxism and, what was it? Marxism and Study of Nature or something. But it had a very interesting chapter, which struck me very forcefully when I read it. It claimed, and I think he was absolutely right, it claimed that the chapter was called On the Non-Ontological Character of Marx's Materialism, which was a novel idea for me then, but when I read it, I was completely persuaded by that. His argument was that when Marx calls himself a materialist, he does not claim to be a materialist in the sense in which, people separated materialists off from the idealists, or people called themselves materialists, in the long history of European philosophy. European philosophy has a very long tradition of the distinction between materialism and idealism, which is about the ontological questions of nature, reality, etc. And in his view, and he convinced me, that Marx's invocation of materialism was not that. Marx was not an ontological materialist. And this is something which actually goes back to a problem which you will discover if you read the Marx literature quite widely. You will find very often people who are commentators on Marx, they are troubled by the question of whether Marx is a materialist or an idealist, because Marx is obviously extremely heavily influenced by Hegel, right? How can somebody who is a materialist, absorb things which are coming from a person who is also a self-confessed and obvious idealist? So a lot of people have reflected on this question and have felt embarrassed and troubled or felt an unease in saying that Marx is a materialist in the ontological sense. But what does it mean then? What does this concern with materialism? Because it's very insistent in Marx. If you read Marx, you will find that very often he would say that I'm a materialist and therefore I have to say this. What is the meaning of materialism now? Historically, if we look back on Marx, and is this something which is significant or relatively minor in Marx's thinking? I believe that, the concern with materialism is very significant in Marx, but it's non-ontological. Marx is not taking part in the ontological debate between idealist and materialist, and it's because of that it does not actually trouble him that he's taking certain things from Hegel. I think, however, to say that Marx is taking something from Hegel is misleading, because his taking is a very strange way of taking, in the sense he obviously draws something out of Hegel, but he transforms what he draws at the same time. So taking is not borrowing in the obvious sense of the term, and that's why I've also become very critical of something that we took for granted when we were very young from Lenin. Lenin has a famous piece in which he says, the piece is actually called Three Sources and Three Components of Marxism. I think that argument has to be finessed and complicated and refined. There's no doubt that these are the three sources of Marxism, in the sense that Marx's ideas, for Marx's ideas, those ideas are preconditions. In Indian philosophy, we have a beautiful concept, which you don't use very often, but which I think is very useful here. Indian philosophers of different schools would always say that when you encounter a philosophical argument, it's a paksha. In Bengali, we would say it's a pokho. Bipokho, pokho, ittadi, ei orthe pokho. It's a paksha. Paksha basically means a set of propositions which are tightened in a knot, right, linked together coherently in a certain kind of argumentative structure, so that it becomes an argument, right? It's because of that we would say, uni or pokkhe bolechen. Pokkhe bola mane hocche je he has actually given an argument in favor of that. So paksha is basically an argument. And they would say that any paksha that you are studying is an uttara paksha of something which is a purva paksha. Purva paksha is an argument in terms of which you make up your argument, right? I could have said that against which you make up your argument, but against, the meaning of the term against actually slips into something else. Against does not mean in opposition to. Against basically means in relation to, right? So it's a wider notion of against. So I think the relation between Hegel and Marx is this kind of Purva Paksha, Uttara Paksha relation, rather than a relationship of borrowing. And I don't think we should say that these are components of Marxism, because an unreconstructed Hegelian theory of history would not sit very well with the Marxian kind of theory of capitalism, or an unreconstructed borrowing of the analysis of the capitalist economy from Adam Smith, for instance. So these are not components. These are things which are drawn in that self-transforming sense from these three great traditions: the French tradition of socialist political thought, the German tradition of thinking about history, and the British tradition, not the English, but the British tradition of thinking about political economy. Now, going back to the question of materialism, what does materialism mean then? I think materialism means something which is absolutely fundamental. I think if you look at earlier forms of political theory, everyday life, whether somebody has a shirt on his back or not, whether somebody is actually trembling in the cold in a cold country, somebody is exposed to the sun in a hot country, right? The physical experience of nature, the physical experience of the world in our life is something which is not given any attention at all. And particularly, I think Marxist materialism is directed against certain types of religious philosophies, particularly Christianity in his context. But I think we can make use of similar arguments in case of other religions as well, which tended to direct people, by very sophisticated, plausible ethical arguments, to disregard the material experiences that they had of human life. So poverty is not a very great concern. Poverty is something which you should ignore, because the most important thing is that you should try to be close to God, or you should try to be compassionate to other people, etc. I think Marx's theory, along with materialists of other types, Enlightenment thinkers, etc., draws our attention insistently, powerfully, to this aspect of human life. And because of that, I'm not very surprised that in the last 10 years or so, I have found a lot of Marxists, particularly Marxist economists, to turn towards a kind of environmental spin on Marxism. Lots and lots of Marxist economists now are at the forefront of the environmental critique. And I think the environmental critique is the right way of developing this kind of theme in Marx, the theme that I call materialism. But anyway, let me now turn to the other things which I understand better, because they fall in my field of political theory and intellectual history. The second point, which I find that when I give these lectures in Europe, and also in America, sometimes surprises people, but much of the time I'm also able to convince people on this, is on the question of history. It's common knowledge that actually Marx contributes very powerfully to a certain kind of understanding of history. But that's a vague and almost meaningless statement. So I want to take you through my understanding of what Marx contributes to the modern sense of history. And when I give lectures to people who are much more familiar with, let's say, the history of German thought, etc., I argue that, to my mind, Marx belongs to a tradition of German historicism. German historicism is a tradition which runs from Hegel, who I think is actually the originator of the great ideas, some of the most profound insights about modern history and historicity. And ordinarily people believe that that line of thinking runs from Hegel through Dilthey to Gadamer and people like that, who are known generally as historicists. I personally believe, completely against the tradition of philosophical interpretation, that Marx is a very, very important thinker in the tradition of German historicism. So let me make that point more textually. I think Hegel stands at the start of the modern conception of history. What does that mean? So let me take you very briefly through a kind of brief intellectual history of the understanding of the concept of history. If you look at people before Hegel, before the rise of modern German philosophy, history is generally seen as something which is very close to a chronicle. Chronicles are very old. The Muslims have a very long tradition of writing chronicles. Europeans also have a long tradition of writing chronicles. The chronicles essentially have two purposes. One purpose of the chronicle is to give you an accurate picture of certain events that happened in history. So the conception of history, let us say, in somebody like Voltaire, who is a supremely intelligent person, who is one of the major thinkers of the Enlightenment, if you ask the question, what does history mean to Voltaire? Voltaire wrote quite a lot of history. David Hume, another big figure in English Enlightenment, he is a writer of history. What does history mean to them? History means to them trying to keep, as much as possible, an accurate record of what has happened through a chain of historical events. And both Voltaire and Hume, they are great philosophers and ambitious thinkers, so they did not stop simply by producing a chronicle. They also thought that the task of history is partially, at least, explanatory. That is, I must first recount what had happened accurately, and secondly, I must also try to answer the question, why did the events happen the way they did, right? So these two compose modern history before Hegel. What Hegel does is, if you look at Hegel's philosophy of history, Hegel changes the nature of the question which lies at the heart of the enterprise that we call history. The task of history, Hegel now says, is not just to recount events, because the events are infinite, the events are also extremely diverse. Because the events are infinite, there is no way in which you can actually put your arms, in a sense, around the historical discipline and try to grasp it by a certain kind of definition or a boundary. The task of history is different. The task of history is this, that human experience, the infinity of human experience, can be divided into certain structures of time, not just an endless line of time, right, with infinite points. Structures in the sense that there is a period which we can call the Greek period, a period which we can call the Roman period, a period which we can call, I'm just strictly following Hegel, philosophy of history, the modern period. Every period in history gives us a certain distinct, identifiable structure of human experience, right? This is a simple, very popular, simple level understanding of Hegel. And human experience in every period is organized around some kind of an ideal discipline, intellectual, mental discipline, intellectual and mental principle, right? And famously, according to Hegel, The principle in the Greek period is beauty, the principle in the Roman period is order or law, and the principle in the modern period is freedom. Hegel fudges a little bit because Hegel doesn't tell us anything about the medieval period. But anyway, I'm not interested in the accuracy of Hegel's historical, empirical history. I'm interested in the logic of history, Hegel's understanding of history methodologically. So what does it change? It changes, first of all, it introduces the concept of periodization or temporalization. Germans use the term temporalization. I find it sometimes slightly awkward in English, but what temporalization means is periodization. That what is important for me is not, the differences, everyday difference between 1 year to the next year in the Roman period. What is important for me when we are trying to understand history is what is the difference between the Greek period and the Roman period. So it's a periodized understanding of history. And if you use Koselleck's terminology, it's a temporalized understanding of history. So that's an important thing. But if you have read the philosophy of history in Hegel, you would immediately know that there is also a very powerful intuition in Hegel, which is extremely plausible, but which, to my view, is contested by Marx very profoundly. So there's also something else, because I'm giving this lecture in India, I shouldn't fail to, and because many of you are students, I should not fail to mention that. Because our attitude to European thinkers is usually, it's an attitude of supplication. In fact, I tell my students there that, we tend to fall on our knees before we read the book. And I don't think we should do that, even when you are reading Hegel or Marx or anyone. So one of the very striking things about Hegel's philosophy of history is that it's divided into two parts. I'm digressing slightly, but because you are students, I think I should talk to you a bit about this. It's in two parts. In the first part, you have you have an introductory section, then you have sections on China, Persia, and India, right? And then after that, there's a kind of punctuation, and after that you have European history, which has three parts again: the Greek period, Roman period, German period. But if you look at it closely, you will see that the logic of inquiry or the logic of thinking or explanation in the non-European part and the European part are totally different. To put it slightly polemically, for Hegel, the history of China, India, and Persia, they're cold societies. Those societies do not change. Those are societies which have one single principle, which actually accounts for everything that has happened to them across history. There's a famous passage in the philosophy of history. I haven't got it in front of me, but all of you should read that. You should read the section on on India, and you will note that section where Hegel says that there's nothing to study about modern India which is different from the study of ancient India, because it's the same principle which determines Indian history both in the ancient and the modern period. So India, China, and Persia, they do not have history in that sense. Look at the European section of the philosophy of history. He does not say that this is the great European principle which runs from the Greek period to the modern period. There are many people who think like that, but remember that Hegel does not go in that direction at all. He completely repudiates that. So for him, there is no European principle. It's not the principle of rationality. It's not the principle of, whatever principle you can present and say that this is the European principle. It does not believe that. Europe does not have a single principle in its history. The principle of the Greek period is different from the Roman period, which is different from the modern period. So when you try to understand any period of European history, you are in the presence of true history, fundamental, profound social change. And you have to understand what is the principle of each period. So the study of Europe and the study of non-Europe are done in profoundly different ways, completely different ways. But I'm not interested in that in this lecture. Coming back to Hegel, so Hegel's argument is that if you really want to understand what European history is, try to understand what actually holds together the totality of the experience of social life of people who lived in the whole of the Greek period, right? there is an idealistic principle for him, the principle of beauty, that would explain why the Greek period is the way it is, right? But note one thing. It actually says that there is a certain kind of principle or a certain kind of social experience which is common to all people who are living in this society. Remember, this is why I think it's very important to value and honor Marx. This kind of way of thinking about what is society, the relation between society and its inhabitants, is very, very, very common, right? We share the social world, right? And sharing the social world basically means that we think through similar concepts, we undertake similar actions, and things like that. We share the social world. I think it is here that Marx actually produces the most profound challenge to Hegel's understanding of history. If you read Marx's section on estranged labor, I borrowed this book from Chauhan. This is the famous section where he is talking about alienation, and he says that there are four types of alienation: alienation of the product of labor, alienation in the act of labor, alienation of species being, and alienation of man from man. This is the section where he explains what he means by alienation of man from man. I'll read you just one or two sentences. The alien being to whom labor and the product of labor belongs, in whose service labor is done, and for whose benefit the product of labor is provided, can only be man himself. If the product of labor does not belong to the worker, remember, this is actually something that is discussed in great detail in Althusser and also in Foucault, because Foucault is a direct student of Althusser's. In the first sentence, can only be man himself, right? And in the next sentence, he says, if the product of labor does not belong to the worker, if it confronts him as an alien power, then this can only be because it belongs to some other man than the worker, right? Some other man. The word man is still used, the other man than the worker. If the worker's activity, look at this now, the word man drops out. This is what Althusser means when he says that Marxism is not a humanism. And the great attack in Foucault against humanist social science, right, or humanistic thinking, is essentially this point, which is, I think, encapsulated in this single sentence. If the worker's activity is a torment to him, to another, it must give satisfaction and pleasure. Not the gods, not nature, not the gods is a reference to Feuerbach, not nature, which is a reference to Hegel, but only man himself can be this alien power over man. Look at the last sentence. It is only man himself can be this alien power over man. So the term man is used in two different ways. One in which it says that the worker and the capitalist, they are both men and they are captured under the same concept man. And then in the same sentence he says, how can that be? How can you use the term man, right? Because these are so fundamentally different types of people that you should not use the term, which actually confuses the most profound difference between them, right? Now, I think this is one of the most important contributions of Marx to the understanding of the society that we carry today. So let me give you a very simple illustration of this, which I give every day when I teach undergraduate classes there. It's through a personal experience, but I think it would make it more lively for you. One day I was walking from my home to my office, which is about 19 blocks, and on the way I had nearly reached my office, and suddenly, it is generally an empty road, suddenly a young African American man walks up to me and he asks for some money, which is not very uncommon. Very interesting that in the richest country in the world, begging not really happens. In fact, begging is still quite common in some areas. So he came up to me and asked for some money. I thought that I should give him some money, so it was a cold day, so I was fumbling in my pocket to get $1 or something. And he asked me a very, very interesting and totally unsettling question. So because we were both embarrassed in a certain sense, and so he said, "Sir, have you ever been homeless?" I felt, when after I gave him the money, I was walking back, and I was wondering that, look at the division of social experience between him and me. He's an American. He's an American citizen. Probably, 5 generations of his family have been Americans, right? And he lives in this space, which is a space of kind of upper middle class, university community. He lives in that space apologetically, shrunk as if he has to sort of, shrink within himself, right? Uh, he has to beg in order to survive. Whereas I'm not even an American citizen. I'm only a professor in the university there. But because of class, I walk on the street as if I'm the sovereign of that street. In fact, I'm not shrunk. I'm not embarrassed. I'm not inconvenienced in any sense. So, I tell my students that if somebody, for instance, if I go to India and somebody asks me, what is the Upper West Side like? Which implies that everybody who lives in the Upper West Side lives like that. That is their common social experience. It would be false, because he's somebody who also lives in the Upper West Side. Or if I talk about New York, right next to my university is a part called Harlem, which is now being gentrified, but it was one of the poorest areas in the United States. Even now, I think there are certain areas which are just unimaginably poor. So the point is that, is there a common experience of New York, living in New York? Is there a common experience of living in America? Is there a common experience of living in Indian society or Hindu society? Now, Ambedkar would also say that, there is no common experience of living in a Hindu society. Remember that Ambedkar says that Hindus have no society. Hindus have no society. He is very, very fond of making that point. I think he was alerted to that, sensitized to that to some extent by studying at Columbia, because he studied at Columbia, particularly with Dewey. And Dewey makes this kind of point occasionally. But I think Marx makes this point with the most profound force. That is what he means in this passage, right? So class, for me, basically means what it means for most Marxists, the kind of analysis that we do on the basis of class, economic differences and the difference it makes for our opportunities of life and things like that. But I think most profoundly, this is class. In fact, this is actually the introduction of class in Marx's own thinking, where Marx basically says, if you ask me, what is the point when Marx actually says that abandon the earlier language, which is the non-class humanistic language, and use class language instead, I would actually say that this is the precise sentence in which Marx introduces that. And what is the meaning of that? The meaning of that is to instill into social science, all social thinking, not just Marxist social thinking, this profound understanding that it's true that when we live in a society, we share a lot of things. But society is also fundamentally, fragmented, directed experience. There's no social experience of America. There's no social experience of Kolkata. There's no social experience of Hindu society, right? There is a shared social world, but it is shared in contradiction. It's seen, not merely seen in one way, it is experienced. Experience is actually much, much more than seeing. Seeing is epistemological, and being is ontological. So we experience society in very different ways, depending on where we are in this kind of social structure. And I would want you to agree with me that this kind of thinking today is not restricted to the Marxists. I'm sometimes surprised that Marxists actually do not go into the kind of exposition that I gave you just now, because that, I think, is extremely powerful, and nobody practically can deny the force of this. So this is what I mean by history, historicism, and class. Let me turn to history in a second sense. But before that, let me make another point, which is also very simple. So I would not spend much time on this, but I want you to understand Marx's innovativeness. The term capitalism, I said that, every time somebody uses a wheel or strikes a fire, he acknowledges in a certain sense a debt to somebody who first did it, or the people who first did it. I think that is also true of Marx and the invocation of capitalism. I think before Marx, of course, there were highly intelligent people who saw, like Adam Smith, there's a new kind of economy which is evolving in Europe. And they understood different aspects of that economy, Ricardo, Malthus, Adam Smith, all these people. But I think it is Marx who understood that this is a new kind of economy altogether, and the task of understanding modernity is essentially the task of understanding the logic of functioning of this particular economic mechanism. And he gave it the title capitalism. You do not get capitalism conceptually used that way, even in some of the most profound thinkers about this economy before. And so therefore I believe that every time a defender of capitalism uses the term capitalism, in a certain sense, he is invoking something which we get from Marx. Similarly, for instance, when we refer to the activity of politics as an instrumentalist activity, whether we know his name or not doesn't matter. We're actually using a form of thought or a figure of thought which was first developed by Machiavelli. Now, let me now turn to history in a slightly different way. And the last point I shall make would be about the concept of contradiction. But let me make the point about history a bit more fully. I'll take some time on this because this is very close to my heart. I've written on this in spurts. In fact, I wrote something in '83 on this, but I've also written something very recently, I think last year. It came out in a journal called Constellations. Now, what I find interesting in Marx is, here again, I think Marx is a great pioneer and somebody who breaks completely from Hegel. As I said, in Hegel's case, Hegel has an understanding that the world is very diverse and Europe is not the whole world. So he knows about China, he knows about India. It's to Hegel's credit that given his time, he read voraciously. He read an enormous amount about India. If you look at his aesthetics, for instance, it shows that he's very familiar with a lot of, Indological research and things like that. But I showed you what I consider to be the major weakness of Hegel's historical worldview, that he historicizes Europe, and he does not allow non-Europe, in the non-European world, to be historicized. When we turn to Marx, we find something which is quite astonishing. And in my recent paper, I actually said that this insight, which we get from a reading of Marx, is still not fully realized by the modern social sciences. Let me summarize that argument for you very quickly. There are different stages, as we know, of the evolution of Marx's thinking about history. Marx thinks about history structurally, exactly like Hegel. So he actually gives us 4 or 5 different modes of production or social structures, whatever you want to call it. And the different stages in the evolution of his historical thinking are well known. But I don't think Marxist thinkers, including some thinkers we rightly treat with great regard, like Eric Hobsbawm, have actually read that correctly. I'm very, very critical of something that Hobsbawm wrote about Marx's pre-capitalist economic formations. I shall come back to that in a moment. But Marx's historical thinking evolves, I think, in 3 clear stages. There might be finer stages, but at least there are 3 clear stages. The first stage is in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx says that this is actually the outline of human history, right? All history is the history of class struggle. Look at the sentences carefully. There is no modification, there is no exception. All history, so all human history. And what are the structures in all human history? The famous structures of the primitive communist society, which is a non-class society, then slave society or ancient society. Notice one thing which is different between Hegel and Marx. And don't fall into the trap of thinking that Marx simply borrows from Hegel. On this question, you will see that Hegel's temporalization or Hegel's totalities are different from Marx's, because Hegel thinks that there's a Roman period and a Greek period and a Roman period. In Marx's case, there is one period, which is the period of ancient society, because for Marx, the structure of the economy is the most important, And he believed that in spite of the differences between Greek and Roman societies, it is an identical structure. So anyway, ancient society, feudal society, capitalist society, and hopefully, if you have a revolution, a socialist society. But that is in the future. So you have a kind of rectilinear, unilinear sequence of social structures, which is, if you believe the Communist Manifesto, is actually true for all societies of the world. When you come to 1857-58, Marx is now thinking about the question of capitalism much more seriously. And he's also reading very widely. He's in England. He's sitting in the British Museum. And so therefore, evidence from India, is much more available to him. So if you look at the famous preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, you'll find that he makes that famous remark about base and superstructure. But the most important thing for me is the sequence of forms, sequence of social forms. He says that if we look at history, we find the following sequence of social forms, right? This is strictly what he says. Primitive communism is followed by Asiatic mode of production, ancient society, feudal society, capitalist society, etc. What is interesting here is, if we look into that sentence, if you look into that passage closely, and then say that I shall try to make sense of this. You cannot make sense of this by going back to the Communist Manifesto line, unilinear line, because Asiatic mode of production obviously doesn't fit there. You cannot take the Communist Manifesto line and then put Asiatic mode of production before ancient society, because it's an Asiatic mode of production. It's not part of European history. So what you are forced to do, although this is actually written like a sequence, if you imagine this as a diagram, there's a profound difference, because he leaves the unilinear line, for Europe, and then he thinks that from primitive communism there is a separate line which comes out in many other societies, which he calls the Asiatic mode of production, right? So his conception of history becomes multilinear, right? It moves away, I think, in the most profound manner. It's just one word, right? But I think the logical implication of that one word is absolutely immense, because you can now think of a diagram where you have a separate line, which is true of India and Asiatic societies, etc. And famously, towards the end of his life, he has correspondence on the one side with Engels, and on the other side with Russian radicals like Vera Zasulich and others, in which he starts speculating whether this kind of periodization is enough. And particularly to Engels, Engels and Marx both write to each other that probably we have overgeneralized when we have said that feudalism is a society which actually spans across Europe. Engels particularly writes, the more we look at the German Mark, which is the medieval German village, he said that it has distinctive features which we probably should not actually collapse into the category of feudalism. And Marx says that there are certain features of the Russian Mir, which is the name for the Russian village, which are also distinct not merely from feudalism, but also from the German Mark. So let us now think of, at least hypothesizing, there are two other tracks. One is the Germanic social form, and the other one is the Slavonic social form. So what do we get out of this? In my reading, this is the main argument of my book, my paper. In my reading, Marx is doing something which is absolutely fundamental, that whenever he comes across the evidence of a society which is very different in its structure, right, he does not do what later Marxists did. He does not slap on them, casually, the conceptualization of a feudal society. Anything which is pre-modern is feudal, right? For Marx, feudal is the pre-modern European society and West European society, because he is hesitant whether he should apply the category feudal even to Germany, not to speak of Eastern Europe. So my methodological point is that every time he comes across a body of historical difference, to use more post-colonial language. My paper, by the way, is called Marx and Post-Colonial Thinking. So whenever he comes across a different body of material, right, he conceptualizes it differently. He hypothesizes a Germanic mode of production or Germanic social form, a Slavonic social form. So what I take out of this, my dissatisfaction with Hobsbawm is, Hobsbawm, if you read Hobsbawm's famous introduction to the pre-capitalist economic forms, I think it says a lot of things which are right, but on this I think Hobsbawm is certainly wrong. He says that instead of those 5 categories and unilinear understanding of history, we now have a multilinear understanding of history, and we have probably 7 categories or something. I think that is absurd. I think what we get out of it is not the move from 4 to 7 or 4 to 8 or something like that. We get a methodological sanction for something which says that if you come across historical difference, right, don't collapse it back into European categories like feudal. Try to use new categories, try to conceptualize, with new categories, and give it a new conceptual name, a new categorical kind of name. So that's my reading of Marx's thinking of history. So I believe, what is the implication of this today? Because I'm making a simultaneously double claim for each one of these points that I'm making. That on the one side I'm claiming that even in Marx's time, this is something which is highly interesting and pioneering. I'm also saying that this is something which has actually sunk into what is something like a kind of commonsensical truth of modern social science. So anybody who does social science seriously is actually obliged to acknowledge the truth of this. So what is the truth of this today? I think the truth of this today is the following. I think if you look at the modern social science from one point of view, I think modern social science is in a crisis, because, I'll put it very simply, because from the 1950s to today, social sciences have amassed a huge collection of empirical, historical, descriptive data about non-European societies. What people knew in the 1950s and what we know today, there's an absolutely incalculable difference in the empirical knowledge about other societies. But when we think about those things, the theoretical concepts that we use are still all taken from the conceptualization of theoretical categories from European social sciences of the 18th and the 19th century. So I have argued in my paper that there is something like what I would call a vicious triangle, that if you think of the activity of doing theory as a 3-stage activity, you do empirical analysis, empirical historical analysis, then you go into a higher level of analytical understanding of those things, and then producing theoretical concepts. That is what people like Weber, Marx, Tocqueville, Hegel, all of them did on the basis of European history and European experience. So it's a 3-level thing. When we now know about the empirical history of the other societies, we need to do the same thing, for these regions of the world. But we do not do that. So what happens is that, we know a lot at the lower level, at the empirical level, but the conceptualization is all essentially dragged, forcibly dragged from there, and it's not surprising that it doesn't work. So that's what I call a kind of vicious triangle, that it's only European theory which is highly developed, and the theoretical thinking about the other societies are actually very poorly developed by comparison. And I personally believe that if you look at the logic of Marx's thinking about history, Marx does something which is absolutely right, which I think social science has not followed. So in a certain sense, I think Marx is still ahead of our time on this question. So let me make the last 4th point and finish. The conceptual term for this is contradiction. Now, Marx saw the configuration of what we call modernity as essentially contradictory. What does contradictory mean? Contradictory means that it rejects an uncomplicated theory of progress which is sometimes attributed to him. I'm actually really distressed when I find that, in modern social science and modern cultural theory, there's a very casual, unheeding, denunciation of the Enlightenment, which I do not accept, because I think there are huge parts of modern thinking which are drawn from the Enlightenment and which are perfectly true. It's true that Enlightenment thinking sometimes goes in a direction of excess on many different points. There's no doubt that there's a kind of excessive emphasis on instrumental rationality. All that is true. But remember that even people who push that argument most powerfully in modern times, Adorno and Horkheimer, they call their book the dialectic of enlightenment, right? For them, enlightenment is not a term of abuse. They're essentially straining against a conception of the enlightenment which is just one-sided and sort of singularly progressivistic, and they're pushing against it to say to people that enlightenment and modernity is contradictory. I'm troubled today by a trend in modern social science and humanistic disciplines, which sees the Enlightenment essentially as a totally unmitigated disaster. I find a lot of friends in my department, in other many American university departments, who think of modernity as something which is, as I said, is a kind of unmixed disaster for humanity. I do not agree with that. And I also do not agree with this picture of the Enlightenment and all Enlightenment thinkers being essentially simple-minded progressivists, right? And then our task in critical thinking becomes sort of calling into question that entire tradition of Enlightenment and thinking of modernity in a Rousseauesque kind of way, not a Marxist kind of way, but a Rousseauesque kind of way, as something which is entirely negative and bad for humanity. So I want to go back, to a conception of modernity which is contradictory. I believe we should try to rescue the Marxian vision of the modern world as partially plastic in the sense that it's a world that we make through our own action, but we cannot control entirely. So that is one reason why it is contradictory. But it is also true that most of the things that modernity creates in technology, in the creation of social institutions and things like that, they are all contradictory in that sense. In fact, they have enormous powers of doing good to humanity. But they also have, if they are uncontrolled or if they are put in a particular kind of direction, they can also cause enormous harm for humanity. So I personally believe that, this is the fourth thing that I value most about Marx, the recuperation of an understanding of modernity, as not an evil, which has to be eradicated, but a contradictory present, contradictory legacy, which has to be embraced, but it has to be embraced critically. So I want to finish now. So many of these ideas are so widely accepted today, I think, that they're not seen distinctly as belonging to or coming from an individual thinker. But to my mind, all these come from Marx. Even if his name is erased from all of them, every time we use them, we pay an unwitting homage to his thinking. Even if he is entirely forgotten, to the historian of ideas, his influence is pervasive in the world in which we live, including social science, which is very anti-progressivistic. Capitalist culture habituates us to an excessively individualistic conception of authorship, of ideas, and induces us to think that our ideas are our own. Let me make a point very quickly about this, again, because of the students. I sometimes tell students that, it's interesting, it's amusing how a capitalist economy habituates us to claiming things which are patently absurd. I'm reminded, I tell them give them the example sometimes of my buying some land in the mountains, a small plot of land, and I was talking to an IIT engineer. He said something which I found very interesting. It did not strike me, although I was a social scientist. He was an engineer, but obviously very clever, and it struck him. He said that when you get the deed for the land, the deed would say that this land actually belongs to Sudipta Kaviraj in perpetuity, which literally means that 700 years from now, somebody who is my successor would have unrestricted property right over this land, which is clearly absurd. But this absurdity is required because capitalism actually wants to reinforce the idea of unrestricted enjoyment of property. So similarly, we get used to a culture in which we think of ideas as our own, and I tell my students that you should pick up the paper that you think is the best paper that you have written in your life. You are all students in a good university, so all of you are very good intellectually, but take a marker pen and mark the sentences about which you can say that nobody in history has actually thought this before you. And you will realize that there are very few sentences that you can mark like that. That does not mean that these are not your thoughts. Of course they are your thoughts, but that is the nature of human thought. Human thought is never individual, and it cannot be characterized through this kind of positive individualistic characterization. So these are our thoughts, but we never think our thoughts except through the thought of others. And so we think our thoughts through the prior thought of others, and the thoughts through which we think today, every day about the modern world, some of the most profound ones originated in Marx. So his name now exists, I think, in a strange place between a profound form of memory and also a profound form of forgetting. Thank you.
Well, friends, as I was listening to Sudipta, I believe it was a very unusual take on Marx's sense of history, and at the same time, the way he tried to relate. It was not very, he did not very directly focus on that point, that is the sense of truth. I will not summarize. That is not, I think, my job also. I will not summarize what he has stated. You have all listened to his extremely insightful lecture. And I'm quite sure that many of you will raise questions. But we have our constraint of time. So I will just, I've just tried to draw certain clues from what he has stated. So I'm just placing before you some clues which we can, you can say clues, you can say keys, you can say leads, which his lecture has given us. And maybe on the basis of these leads you can raise further questions. And I have just jotted down 4 such points, not those 4 points which he has identified, but the four such perhaps leads may emerge from what he has stated. One is that Marx's sense of history, well, did he at all, and particularly when he was talking of this contrast between Hegel and Marx, Hegel's reading of history, Marx's reading of history, that did Marx really espouse any sense of universal history, universal truth? The problem is that when we, in our common sense understanding of Marx, we relate our own ideas to Marx, or to be somewhat blunt when we try to make use of Marx, we always try to argue that Marx had a universal sense of history. He universalized certain things. So did Marx at all stand for any such universalist notion of history, universal. Did he claim any such truth? This is question number one. The second one, I think this clue emerges out of his emphasis on the last point, contradiction. In fact, that reminded me, and Sudipta, I'm quite sure, remembers it, because at that time we had just passed out of the university. That was a debate, actually. The debate was between Karl Popper and Maurice Comforth. Popper's book we had already read, Open Society and Its Enemies. In that book, actually, Popper had made very well-known allegation. Many of you know it. Popper had made the allegation that Marx, Hegel, Plato, well, they all tried to defend the kinds of, say, universalist, that is, universalist, totalistic sense of history and truth, which takes away human freedom, autonomy, etc., etc. Now, Maurice Comforth, as far as I remember, it was the year 1968. Maurice Comforth, 68 or 69, around that time. So Maurice Comforth came out with a book, The Open Society and Open Philosophy. And it had a subtitle, I do not remember the exact subtitle. The subtitle was like this, a reply to Karl Popper's, etc., etc. It's like this. It was a reply to Popper's book. In the last chapter of that book, Maurice Comforth had made a very interesting statement. I think that makes actually one aware of the importance of contradiction in Marx. He said that, well, if somebody says, as Popper has tried to argue, or as Popper has tried to convince us, that yes, Marx stood for a kind of, say, universalist sense of history, this kind of, say, understanding of history, that his history necessarily moves through all these phases, this primitive communism, slavery, etc., that structure. He says, no, that is, Marx did not at all stand for any such sense of history, or he was not a claimant of any such notion of truth. What Marx, if Marx had a sense of truth which he tried to put forward, then that was just one principle. That is the principle of contradiction. History moves through, or history is to be explained through, the contradiction between productive force and production relations. That is the dynamics of history. So contradiction, that is the driving force of history. That was, if there is any element of truth in Marx, that is the element of truth. Not that schematics understanding of history and that it will have to be repeated in all societies. That is not Marx. That is second. The third point, I think, that is not exactly touched upon by Sudipta, but I mean, this is a question that emerges from not only what he has stated, but especially from the recent studies on Marx. Rather, I would say the kind of rediscovery of Marx that has been initiated after this this is the complete works of Marx, which is the huge project about which on which I focused in my first lecture. And that question, of course, remains unsettled till now. Maybe future researches, future studies will ultimately answer this question. That is, was Marx interested in history as such? Or is it that Marx was primarily interested in the study of capitalism? He was primarily interested in the study of the present. That was his main agenda. In order to understand the present, well, he had to go back to history. He made use of history. But as such, he was not perhaps interested in history. So that question, in a way, remains, I think, unsettled till now. But many evidences that are emerging now, they are, giving rise to this question that was Marx a disinterested historian? When we relate Marx to history, or is it that he was primarily interested in capitalism? That was the existential reality which he was encountering. So in order to understand capitalism, I have to understand the prehistory of capitalism. I have to go back to the past. Or was he interested really in ancient world, etc., etc.? Because the problem is arising because now the new notebooks of Marx, which are emerging, he took so many extensive notes on ancient society, ancient world, etc., etc. So why he was doing this? We don't know the answer. And the fourth and last point, I think that is a very, very, very important point raised by Sudipta. Of late, in fact, this is becoming a very major question. That is Marx on the non-Western world. And that way, Marx is so different from Hegel. And that shows the notion of flexibility in Marx. Because there is a common allegation, especially put forward by post-colonial writers, post-colonial thinkers, that Marx was essentially, right from the beginning to end, Marx was guided by a notion of Eurocentrism. But I think there are new researches that are coming out, the new findings on Marx that are coming out, very clearly indicate that Marx was extremely flexible, and especially the point that Sudipta has stated very rightly, I think. That is Marx's interest in the East. Marx shifting his focus from industrialist West to non-industrial, underdevelopment East. And especially, perhaps many of you know that Marx became very much interested in Russia, and in order to understand Russia, he picked up Russian language in the last years of his life. And his interest in non-Western world, somewhere I read, I do not remember the exact source, but somewhere I read, that is Engels, he became very, very much interested, so much so, in the non-Western societies, that he started learning Arabic. West was now gone. After 1871, Paris Commune finished. So now the focus is the East. And on this issue, I would like just draw your kind attention to 2 or 3 writings. One is Kevin Anderson's Marx and the Non-Western World, an excellent work which everybody should read in the context of this discussion. The other is this book came out long back in the 70s, but many of us just didn't consider it. Hardly, just a few persons knew about it. The Ethnological Notebooks of Marx, where you have a special section on Bengal, how Marx is interested in studying Bengal. And the last thing is that recent studies indicate, I'm not going into any detail, recent studies indicate that there was a major shift in Marx's understanding of India in his later writings. Marx's original understanding when he's writing this New York Daily Tribune writings on Marx, on India, 1857 and all this, that very controversial statement that that is British rule in India, it has 2 aspects. Marx in the later years of his life has radically changed his position. So that allegation that Marx was Eurocentric, that Marx remained a European, well, and I think that there Sudipta has very rightly drawn our attention to this dynamics of Marxist thinking. So I have just put before you some of these things, and I think now it is open for discussion. I think we can have about half an hour. And questions you can raise in English, you can raise in Bengali. ইংরেজি বাংলা যাতে ইচ্ছে আপনারা প্রশ্ন করতে পারেন, কিন্তু আমি জানি অনেকের মনে অনেক প্রশ্ন আছে, কিন্তু উনি অনেকক্ষণ ধরে বলেছেন, সো ইউ আর yes, you are free, but please be very precise and don't go for extensive comments, extensive observations. Very precise question. So